But first, how tens of thousands of children in England are attending schools with roofs that could collapse at any moment. An ITV News investigation has found 68 schools were built with a certain type of cheap reinforced concrete known as RAAC. Installed on a mass scale from the 1960s, RAAC has a lifespan of around 30 years. And the government now says it's liable to collapse with little or no warning. We found one school propping up ceilings with wood to make sure the concrete doesn't come down. But it could be just the tip of the iceberg. Almost 1,500 schools we surveyed had no idea whether their building contained the material. Here's our investigations correspondent, Daniel Hewitt, with this exclusive report.
There is, at first glance, nothing unusual about Abbey Lane Primary. But inside this Sheffield school, children as young as 4 and 5 are having to learn under 60-year-old roofs made from concrete that's been deemed at risk of collapse, where in parts the ceiling is having to be held up by wooden props.
So the Y1 classroom was built in the 60s.
On her daily walk of the school corridors, Maxine has to be more vigilant than most head teachers.
But this roof needs to come down.
It does need to come down.
2 years ago, she discovered parts of the building were made from an old, lightweight concrete that is now well past its natural lifespan, including in this classroom used for Year 1 pupils.
And you put that prop in because it could come down?
Because it started to crumble. So to make sure that it doesn't come down, and we've had assurances that it is safe. It's worrying that we've got materials that have been used that we're now aware are critical.
The problems are the buildings with the flat roofs. Built in the 1960s, they're made of reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, or RAAC, a weaker building material with a typical lifespan of 30 years that the Department for Education says is liable to collapse with little or no warning.
So this area here, again, is covered with all the RAACs, the RAACs.
Here, it will take £500,000 to replace.
It absolutely should be a given that children enter school in buildings that are safe, and that the funding from governments and local authorities are there to make sure those buildings are safe and are at good repair. And that's not always the case. And for various reasons, it's not been identified early enough, and that's really frustrating because you're always at the back of your head going, well, there was an element of risk to the children at this point and an element of risk to my staff.
This is not the only school with this old, lightweight concrete, but perhaps more worrying is the sheer number of schools in this country that don't know whether they have it or not, and therefore haven't been able to put in the kind of safety measures that this school have.
Like Singlewell Primary School in Kent, they didn't know they had RAAC until the roof collapsed without warning. Luckily, and it was pure luck, it caved in on a weekend when no children were inside. That was in 2018, and despite a national safety alert going out to schools about the concrete, 5 years on, our investigation has found schools still at risk. We contacted almost 6,000 schools in England. Almost 1,500 told us they still don't know if they have RAAC, including over 1,200 primary schools. 68 schools confirm they do and are trying to manage it. We also found that 3,700 schools run by local authorities have been identified as needing an inspection for RAAC. But of those, fewer than half have been inspected. More than 2,000 schools still haven't been checked.
We don't know what schools have got RAAC and what schools haven't got RAAC. And a visual survey will not assess it. You actually have to do some investigative work within the concrete. And it's a ticking time bomb. Do you want to take the risk of not looking at it just because your school may not have RAAC concrete? I wouldn't want to if I was sending my kids there.
To see the difference between RAAC and modern concrete, we've come to Loughborough University to meet the country's leading experts and watch it being tested. Firstly, Professor Chris Goodyear demonstrates how light RAAC is.
Here's a traditional piece of concrete and here's a piece of RAAC. As you'll see, it actually floats on water. It's pretty amazing for a piece of concrete.
Why could this be a potential problem, that sinks and that floats?
If you keep the RAAC nice and dry, then you're fine. But if you let water get to it, it can soak up the water, and if that water gets to the reinforcement that's inside, it can corrode the reinforcement and make it rusty.
And that's potentially why it could be prone to collapse. effectively.
Potentially.
RAAC is also much weaker. On the left, 30 tonnes of weight is being applied to the modern concrete and it barely moves, while the RAAC disintegrates under a tenth of that pressure.
This is the RAAC concrete. It's just falling apart.
But post-war, we had a lot of factories building a lot of buildings very quickly because we needed to, and some of them were rushed, and the quality control just wasn't as good as it could be or as it would be nowadays.
The Department for Education told us it takes the safety of pupils and staff extremely seriously and is working with schools to help identify and manage RAAC. It says those responsible for schools have been asked to respond to a questionnaire on whether or not they have it. Back at Abbey Lane Primary, work to remove the RAAC roofs will begin in the summer. They've been assured they are safe until then, but many other schools are right now unaware of this hidden danger.
And so was that on the advice?
What's just astounding, Daniel, is there are so many schools that have no idea if they've got this issue.
That's right. I mean, this is the stuff we're talking about here. It's pretty light. It's not great. This was actually taken from a building that collapsed. This is the RAAC concrete. It's incredibly light. You can see here where the reinforcement corroded and collapsed, and you can see why it would have collapsed. When you take this piece of RAAC concrete, it's so light, it just crumbles in front of you. It's a real problem because it's hidden. You don't know it's going to collapse. It doesn't crack like normal concrete, so it just falls. Now, I will clean this up for you, Sharon, later. In 2018, the school that collapsed in Kent should have been a warning. That warning wasn't heeded. What we have right now is the Department for Education saying that schools need to find out whether they've got it and tell us. What the schools say is it costs money to inspect their roofs to find out whether they've got this, money that they don't have in their school budget. If you compare what's happened with schools to NHS hospitals, when RAAC was found in NHS hospitals, the government announced it would be removed by 2035. £685 million will be set aside to make that happen. With schools, there is no such plan, and right now there is no such pot of money. The worry here, of course, is the unthinkable. And I suspect the government is going to have to come up with some kind of plan, some kind of target, some kind of money to deal with this before potentially the unthinkable happens.
All right, Dan, thanks very much.